When the American Revolution ended in 1783, tension remained high between the United States and Great Britain. Tension turned to conflict in 1812 when the Americans declared war on the British. There were four main reasons for the declaration of war. Embroiled in a long war with Napoleonic France, the British regularly seized neutral ships to enforce orders in council that required all ships sailing to Europe to apply for a license. By 1812, almost 400 American ships had been seized, disrupting export trade and profits. The Royal Navy frequently stopped American vessels and removed sailors, forcing them to serve on British ships. On land, settlers continued to displace Native Americans, and the British were seen as allies of the First Nations, supplying them with weapons, stirring up trouble, and interfering with U.S. expansion. At the same time, a group of U.S. congressmen known as the War Hawks put pressure on President James Madison to declare war. These four causes brought on the U.S. declaration of war in 1812. Shortly after the declaration of war, the first actions began a pattern of conflict that would involve 300 major battles and skirmishes over 32 months. In one of the earliest actions, the crew of the General Hunter captured the U.S. schooner 𝐃𝐈𝐒𝐂𝐋𝐀 and U.S. General William Hull's papers on the Detroit River, July 2, 1812. 10 days later, an American invasion force crossing the Detroit River was repulsed. In August, putting the information in General Hull's captured papers to good use, General Isaac Brock's combined force captured Detroit. In October of 1812, the Americans were stopped in the Battle of Queenston Heights, which was probably the most famous land battle of the war. A critical win for the combined British-Canadian First Nations forces, it came at a high cost. General Isaac Brock was killed in the battle. During 1812, there was limited naval action, most of it minor skirmishes. In the spring of 1813, however, the Americans captured and burned much of York, now known as Toronto, and within a month they had captured Fort George on the Niagara River and turned back a British assault at Sackett's Harbor. In June of 1813, the combined forces stopped an American offensive near present-day Hamilton in a confusing and costly battle at Stony Creek. 2 weeks later, in a battle that made Laura Secord a national heroine, the Americans surrendered to a force made up almost entirely of First Nations warriors at the Battle of Beaver Dams. One of their most important First Nation allies, Tecumseh, was killed in the fighting. Later in 1813, two American thrusts against Montreal were defeated, one by a force of British regulars and Canadian militia at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, and the other at the Battle of Chateauguay. The year ended with the British crossing the Niagara River to capture Fort Niagara. On the lakes in 1813, the main action between the two opposing sides involved the construction of ships, each side trying to outbuild the other. There were few real battles during August and September, though there were several encounters, including an hour-long action called the Burlington Races, which ended with the British retiring to the safety of Burlington Bay. In 1814, much of the action took place along the Niagara frontier. In July, the Americans crossed the border and defeated a British-Canadian force in the Battle of Chippewa, then followed up by taking control of a large section of the Niagara border region. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and 2 weeks later, following the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the bloodiest of the war, the Americans withdrew and the last invasion of Upper Canada ended. In August, a British force captured Washington and burned the White House. In the north, an amphibious force attempting to retake Mackinac Island was quickly stopped and driven back to its ships. Two vessels stationed to blockade the island fort were captured in a night attack by 4 boatloads of men from the fort. This gave the British and Canadians a small presence on Lake Huron for the rest of 1814. In September of 1814, a British offensive aimed at Vermont and Upper New York State was stopped in the Battle of Lake Champlain. With their supply line on the lake blocked, the British retreated and didn't return. The naval games continued on the Great Lakes, with each opponent trying to outbuild the other. In April of 1914, the British blockaded the main U.S. base at Sackett's Harbor. In July, the U.S. blockaded Kingston, but when the new 112-gun British warship St. Lawrence was launched, the Americans quickly left the Kingston area. The war ended with a British loss at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814, but satisfied no one. Both governments were so eager to reach an agreement that the treaty completely ignored the causes of the war and returned all captured territories. It's estimated that as many as 35,000 people may have died during the war, but most of those deaths were caused by disease and starvation. Only about 20% were actual battle deaths. Based on the treaty, which determined the outcome of the war, many determined it to be a draw. By examining the aims and objectives of the participants, it is possible to suggest Canada won because it preserved its borders and British identity. Great Britain accomplished its goal of retaining its North American colonies. The United States was unable to end the abuse by the British of maritime rights, and it was unable to expand into Canada. For the First Nations participants, whose objective was to halt the loss of their lands and way of life, there was nothing in the treaty to help achieve their objective.